Good morning, Sardis. I want to begin with a word of thanks for all that you do to help us maintain the ministries and communications and activities of this place called Sardis Baptist Church. A special word of thanks to our staff for their hard work, to Catherine for all her work in getting our worship guide completed, to Hillary and Irina for their beautiful music. Special thanks to Clark for his addition to our service this morning, as well as to our choir for their hard work in sharing today's hymn. Also want to thank Tilly and Jonathan and Hillary for their leadership and participation in the planning of today's liturgy. Most of all, I want to thank each of you, the church at Sardis, for your role in today's service. It's your energy, your participation, your love, and your continued pursuit of justice that helps us to be the church called Sardis. So thank you. Our lesson this morning comes from Matthew's Gospel, chapter 25, verses 1 through 13. Hear now these good words. Verse 1 begins, "Then the kingdom of heaven will be like this. 10 bridesmaids took their lamps and went to meet the bridegroom. 5 of them were foolish and 5 were wise. When the foolish took their lamps, they took no oil with them, but the wise took flasks of oil with their lamps. As the bridegroom was delayed, all of them became drowsy and slept. But at midnight there was a shout, 'Look, here is the bridegroom, come out to meet him.' Then all those bridesmaids got up and trimmed their lamps. The foolish said to the wise, 'Give us some of your oil, for our lamps are going out.' But the wise replied, 'No, there will not be enough for you and for us. You had better go to the dealers and buy some for yourselves.' And while they went to buy it, the bridegroom came, and those who were ready went with him into the wedding banquet, and the door was shut. Later, the other bridesmaids came also, saying, 'Lord, Lord, open to us.' But he replied, 'Truly, I tell you, I do not know you. Keep awake, therefore, for you neither know the day nor the hour.'" Sardis Baptist Church, this is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. This morning's sermon is entitled, "It's a Parable, Silly." You know the story. There was going to be a huge party, a wedding feast or celebration to rival the biggest soiree you can imagine. And the most handsome bridegroom was going to come calling on 10 intelligent, charismatic, beautiful, virtuous, strong women who would bear torches and help this young man welcome his bride like Arthur welcomed Guinevere. But something happened. The bridegroom missed his Uber or got detained finishing arrangements for the party, or maybe he was just waiting for CNN to tell him the final vote tally, and he was delayed. So delayed, in fact, that he didn't arrive until well after midnight. The text tells us that some of these women were more prepared than others. 5 wise bridesmaids brought extra lamp oil. 5 foolish women didn't plan on needing additional supplies. The wise women were prepared, but not prepared beyond their own provisions, and they were unwilling to share with the others. Therefore, the foolish women, and I don't like this characterization of foolish, and I'll say more about that in a minute, but therefore, the foolish women in need of provisions leave in the middle of the night to seek out a dealer of lamp oil. And as luck would have it, the bridegroom arrives in their absence, and he invites the remaining 5 bridesmaids to come with him to the party. When the other 5 finally arrive from their errand, they find the party closed to them, and the bridegroom refuses to acknowledge their presence. I want to submit to you this morning that the way we choose to interpret today's text, and many others like it, has substantial ramifications for how we understand God and how we understand our place in God's world. The ancient media and the medieval media and even the modern media want to package this story into a neat little allegory. Jesus is our bachelor or bridegroom, and his return has been delayed. We don't know when or how he's going to return, but we do know that he will return. The light of our lamps is our faith in Christ's return. The oil is our obedience or discipline or readiness to be alert for Christ's return. The wise are those who prepared, and the foolish are those who are unprepared. Preparation will be rewarded with entrance into the party, God's realm. Unpreparedness will be met with a closed door, a lack of recognition, and the denial of entrance into God's realm. Well, Sardis Baptist Church, I would like for you to consider me an alternative media source because today's text isn't an allegory. It's a parable. And I think that we create significant harm in hearing this morning's text as allegory. I will grant you that there are some good things we can take away from an allegorical application. I wouldn't disagree that we need to be alert for God's presence and prepared to respond to God's call and be obedient in our actions and choices that reflect our convictions. Moses and Miriam, Mary and Jesus, Mary and Martha, Paul and Silas, even the saints we celebrated last week, all of these figures reflect the convergence of alertness, preparedness, and obedience. Would that all in our world model such discipleship. But there's more bad than good. In an allegorical application of our text, we end up assigning specific representation and meaning to specific characters. We characterize and we stereotype and we reinvent ways to make the text support the systems that are around us. We find ways to imagine ourselves as the most enviable characters and our enemies as the least desirable characters. But more than anything, we find ways to justify our privilege and to justify our comfort and to justify our status. Some are chosen and some are not. Here are the exact values of the in crowd. Here are the precise values of the out crowd. Here in this text is the blueprint for having the right values. The unintended consequences of such an allegorical application of the text is this. The allegory, specifically in this instance, speaks the language of commodity. But neither God, nor God's people, nor God's world operate in a commodities-based market. Communion with God is not a commodity. The value of God's light doesn't have diminishing returns, and the dwellings of God's people do not have enforced occupancy levels. It's not a good thing. I repeat, it's not a good thing that 5 women are ignored. 1, because their alienation stands in stark contrast to God's radical hospitality and grace. And 2, because this winnowing process is arbitrary at best, cruel at worst. Yes, the allegory wants to remind us that faith or commitment or understanding, an intangible something, is not something that can simply be given or lent to a neighbor like a can of lighter fluid or a cup of sugar. That is true, but it's not the whole story. We can't give something to our neighbors that they have to reconcile for themselves. But we can give them love, and we can offer empathy, and we can give them encouragement, and we can be witnesses of how to keep the flame of faith alive as we wait for God's presence. In other words, the allegory affords us 0 opportunity and 0 incentive for those deemed wise to be generous to those deemed foolish. But the parable, yes, the parable gives us a bit more leeway. Because parables don't force us to assign meaning or representation to each character. Instead, the parable, if we listen, and we should listen, friends, the parable, if we listen, encourages us to find empathy with the characters we meet, especially in those whom we may not see as neighbors. So, a little bit earlier, I mentioned that I don't like that word foolish, and I especially don't like it as a characterization of half of the 10 women in our story. And to be honest with you, I'm not all that crazy about the word wise. Merriam-Webster's dictionary tells us that both foolish and wise can be markers of judgment and understanding. One who is wise is characterized as a person marked by deep understanding and having a capacity for sound judgment, and also as showing or exhibiting such sound judgment. On the other hand, one who is foolish often lacks good sense or the ability to exhibit sound judgment or discretion. But being wise is not always ideal. One who is wise can also possess inside information or be crafty or shrewd or even insolent, smart-alecky, and fresh. And foolish can be a really cruel description because it can sometimes label a person to mean that they are insignificant. Well, when I read this story as a parable, I'm not drawn to the wise women because honestly, to me, they seem pretty crafty. They feel a lot more like scheming contestants on The Bachelor than they do role models for faithful service. And my heart aches for the foolish women because I think what they are really being labeled as is insignificant. Not only are these women ostracized by their peers, but they are rejected by their host. And what, you may ask, is their crime? They didn't bring enough provisions to an event where the host was too inconsiderate to be on time. And here's a Disney shout out to my millennial audience. If Jesus, the bridegroom, is like Gaston, handsome but dismissive, charismatic but inconsiderate, I don't think the story is painting a very accurate image of the Creator, the Redeemer, and the Sustainer we have come to know and love. The allegory allows us or permits us to think about what we have to do to make sure that we're not the ones left out. The allegory lives in a zero-sum gain world. The allegory affirms our privilege, tells us to be content in our comfort, even if it's at the expense of our neighbors. The parable, on the other hand, forces us, and not in a comfortable way, to think about what we need to do to ensure that our neighbors are not left out. The parable makes us ask ourselves, or perhaps the parable invites us to ask ourselves, are we wise in a way that uses sound judgment? Or are we wise in a way that is crafty, one that allows someone else to be on the outside in order that we can be on the inside? And the parable invites us to see how much we confuse God's world with Caesar's. How we keep seeking to use Caesar's systems, economics and politics and military might, to inform what we believe God's world will be. The parable provokes us to see our neighbors in a new light. Is our neighbor really that foolish? Is our neighbor really someone lacking the pristine discernment and unquestioned righteousness that we have? Or is the real truth that we have deemed our neighbors as being insignificant? And therefore we've deemed that they are not worthy of, not entitled to, not valuable enough to share in our provisions. Friends, when I read this parable, I don't get distracted by this talk of empty lamps and slamming doors and time-stamped receipts. When I read this parable, I see Jesus asking us to remember that we, as God's people, cannot be whole, cannot be full, cannot live into our potential if we do not do the hard work of preparing a world where our neighbors can thrive too, if we do not do the hard work of preparing a world where our neighbors can also be equipped and prepared to receive all of God's provisions, love and joy and hope. I think that means we have to ask ourselves a few questions. What prevents our neighbors from securing the provisions they need? And what role, intentionally or unintentionally, do we have in preventing our neighbors from accessing their needs? And most importantly, what are we going to do to make sure God's is a door that swings wide open instead of slamming shut? I think we can start this morning by hearing our text as a parable. And I think we can start by allowing the words of the parable to provoke a new understanding of our neighbors. Story tells us about 10 women. 5 women, the world called them foolish, arrived with minimum provisions. 5 more women, the world called them wise, arrived with surplus. One foolish woman stood in line on election day for 12 hours. She chose to vote rather than to earn her daily wage, and she could only afford 1 bottle of oil. Her wise counterpart lived in the suburbs, and she voted in 15 minutes and stopped by Walgreens on her lunch break. And, of course, she has a job with paid time off, so she could always just take a personal day if she needed it. One foolish woman took the bus. She had enough money for 1 bottle of oil and 1 bus ticket. She thought it better to be prompt than to have extra oil. The irony of it all is that if she'd have been late, she wouldn't have needed the extra oil. Her wise counterpart had a car and a Costco membership, so she didn't need to worry. Another of these foolish women was young. This was the first feast she'd ever been invited to, and she didn't know the protocol. The wiser, more experienced woman beside her could have easily been a mentor. But there's only so much joy to go around. And besides, sometimes tough love is a good lesson. One foolish woman had the audacity to be from Samaria. She actually found a dealer of oil in the middle of the night, but he wouldn't sell it to her kind. Her wiser counterpart had the good sense to be born in a proper neighborhood, so she had her choice of vendors. One foolish woman lived in an abusive household. Her daddy threatened that if she didn't make a good appearance at this party, he'd beat her to within an inch of her life. She was too traumatized to think about packing extra oil. Her wise counterpart was smart enough to have a loving and supportive set of parents who reminded her to bring oil, extra oil, just in case. So I think about these women, friends, and what occurs to me is that the kingdom of heaven is not about being wise or foolish, prepared or unprepared. The kingdom of heaven is about acknowledging the complete audacity and the complete foolishness of believing that our wisdom or our significance or our value in the eyes of God is connected in any way, shape, or form to earthly privilege. We are completing an agonizing election season, and it sounds like it's going to go on for a little while more. And even in the best of circumstances, We will be creating a world where every bridesmaid has the opportunity to attend the party. The allegory is short-sighted enough to tell us that opportunity, those 10 bridesmaids having opportunity, that's our highest potential. The parable, on the other hand, says God's inbreaking realm is not content with opportunity. God's inbreaking realm is only content with a world where every bridesmaid is known and every bridesmaid is welcomed and every bridesmaid is seated at God's table. And God's realm is only content with a world where every bridesmaid has a name and a descriptor that is far more insightful and far more accurate and far more valuable than words like wise or foolish. Instead, that every bridesmaid may be called child of God. Good friends, on this, the second Sunday of November, may we stop allowing allegory to make us content with worldly justice. And may we start allowing parable to provoke us into working for God's justice. May it be so, and may it be soon. Amen.